I'm Joe Weinman. I'd like to welcome you to this last day of PTC'21. And we have such a great speaker this morning, which is Matthew Prince, who is the founder, the CEO, and the chairman of Cloudflare, which is one of the largest and most exciting and fastest growing and most important, many would argue, companies that helps us use the internet every day. So first of all, let me say welcome, Matthew.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me.
So for people who don't know, what exactly is it that Cloudflare does?
So Cloudflare's mission is to help build a better internet. And for this audience, we act somewhat like a CDN. So if you're familiar with an Akamai or others, architecturally we look similar. We today operate in 200 cities worldwide, in over 100 countries, where we are directly interconnected with ISPs and other networks. And then our customers tend to be anyone who is trying to put content online or be able to operate online. And so when we started the business, we started out by saying there's a whole bunch of small businesses, individual developers that can't afford a service like an Akamai or one of the larger providers, larger legacy providers that are out there. And so we made a very simple service where anyone could take their website, sign up, in some cases at no cost, and be able to get performance services from us. But I think what was really important was we actually started out thinking of ourselves as a security company, where from the beginning, we said, how can we deliver the functionality that you used to have an on-premise piece of hardware from a firewall or otherwise, and how can we deliver that as a service? And so we started with the security piece. We had to build the performance piece because we didn't want to slow the internet down because we thought that would be a non-starter. And we really started with small businesses from the beginning and individual organizations. Today, if you fast forward, 16% of the Fortune 500 rely on Cloudflare's network. We sit in front of somewhere around 15% of all of the web sitting behind our network. And we've expanded our services to not just protect the websites, but actually protect entire networks from a wide range of security, while also helping them be as fast and reliable as possible around the world. And so most of the people who are in the audience, we are probably directly peered with or interconnected with in one way or another, or hopefully, again, that they're using our services to be secure, fast, and reliable online.
So if I were to sum that up, and there's no charge for what I'm about to say, you help keep your customers safe, where safe is secure, available, fast, and everything else that you probably do.
Efficient, and maybe if we're going
to do. There you go. Okay.
Yeah, so, that's right.
Okay. So that said, I guess a good question would be, what are you seeing in terms of trends, especially now in the COVID era, or as we're coming out of the COVID era now with vaccines and so forth? I assume that you saw some ramp ups in traffic. How did that impact you in terms of scale or architecture or new services? And, does that just continue, or does it backtrack a little bit as people start returning to work? What's going to happen in terms of trends?
Yeah, so first of all, one of the things that I think has served us really well architecturally at Cloudflare is that we designed our services from the beginning where every server running in every location can run any of Cloudflare's services. And that means that if we need more load balancing in Singapore, then we dedicate equipment to that. If we need more firewall in Mumbai, then we can dedicate equipment to that. And so because we have that flexibility, I think it's served us really well over time. And COVID was a really, just incredible test of that architecture, where, we saw that as the world locked down in late March and early April of 2020, that the demand on our services went through the roof. And so we saw, on average, north of a 50% increase in less than a week from what the baseline had been to using our services. And we weren't alone. I think ISPs, other cloud providers around the world saw that just dramatic increase in the amount of usage across their services. And what was actually, I think, really very inspiring was how much our teams work together, even with companies that would be competitors of ours, to say, how can we figure this out? How are we going to get through this? Because I think a lot of the people in the audience will look back and in sort of the days in early April and remember that they were the ones really holding the internet together and making some
Thank you for that, by the way.
Well, yeah, I mean, thanks to everyone in the internet and everything from some of the large streaming providers deciding to turn down the quality of their video streams in order to make sure that the internet services worked. People really upgrading their networks on the fly. Us being able to shift traffic around in order to be able to stay on top of it. But it was a harrowing period of time just from the legitimate traffic. And I think that as a result, I think that 2020 has seen or saw an increase in the number of sort of incidents across all of the major cloud providers, across a lot of the others, because we were all kind of figuring out how, when we were running our network so much hotter than usual, how we could keep the lights on. I think the good news of that has been, at least inside of Cloudflare, we have been able to invent technologies, invent new systems for resiliency that will actually pay off over the long term because of what we experienced over the course of the last year. I think that was interesting. What then happened was in sort of the May-June timeframe, after we sort of saw a plateau in the normal traffic growth, we saw, unfortunately, a very substantial increase in the number of cyber attacks that were being launched online. And it started out largely as what I'd call kind of the bored kid variety. And usually under normal circumstances, we do see an increase in cyber attacks right around when school lets out, because kids literally go home from school and they're bored and they launch attacks. And that was sort of the beginning of what we saw. That, unfortunately, and those are relatively easy to stop and not particularly disruptive. Unfortunately, what we saw then after that was a series of very deliberate attacks targeting various pieces of infrastructure. So we saw what appear to have been state-sponsored attacks directed at a lot of the healthcare, hospital, public health information, sort of in the June and July timeframe. And then after that, the U.S. election really started to dominate a lot of the news cycle, and attackers started going after both candidate websites, and we had both of the U.S. presidential candidates as customers, or their campaigns as customers. And then also the actual election infrastructure in the various states. And we had more than half of US states using Cloudflare in order to protect some part of their election infrastructure. And so, I think that the beginning of COVID was really encouraging, where various technology organizations came together to figure out best practices to keep the lights on, to make sure the internet kept working. And I think that was sort of the best of the internet coming through. I think as we got into the back half of the year, a lot of the cyber attacks, and especially, it's incredibly, just almost sickening to think that there are people out there that, while humanity is going through a crisis like this, would be targeting pharmaceutical manufacturers, health organizations, hospitals. And so, I'm proud of the role that we played in protecting all of that, and also in helping ensure that the U.S. election went off, and the cyber attacks weren't a major part of the story.
So in terms of when you said that you had sort of 1 week and you grew 50%, an obvious question is, how does your infrastructure do that? Because I've heard that you've invested in your own infrastructure. And so, how do you go from, is it rapid provisioning to ensure that you're not at over or under capacity in any given, day or hour or minute?
Yeah, it's a combination of things, and COVID made it hard on every metric. So first of all, because every server in every location can run every service, when we spec a generation of servers, it means that we can spec them and essentially depot and warehouse them ahead of time. So we're on we in during COVID, we were on our 10th generation of servers. We're just now coming up with the specifications for our 11th generation of servers, and expect in the next few weeks for that to be nailed down. But we work with various ODM manufacturers in order to manufacture those servers to our specifications. In fact, all of those manufacturers are based in Asia. And so about a year ago, in January of 2020 and February of 2020, we started to get early warning signs that this was going to be a substantial event, that COVID would disrupt a lot of systems. And so we looked at our entire supply chain, and not just to the ODMs, but then looking at the individual component pieces and figuring out what we thought might be disrupted. And we were particularly concerned about actually RAM being disrupted. So we moved forward some of the purchases of that in order to make sure that we would have sufficient supply to be able to continue to operate. But it was interesting, our infrastructure team takes pride in the fact that they think of the way that we deploy infrastructure as almost just in time, where the SLA that they have internally for our teams is that they can double the size of any of our facilities in any of the major locations around the world. And so that's about 100 different locations around the world, or excuse me, 200 locations around the world, 100 countries, but that they can double the size in 30 days or less, which is pretty remarkable. And that again comes from that flexibility of every server running every service and being able to sort of pre-commit to the buys of those servers as we spec a generation. What was interesting though is that COVID created all kinds of problems that we didn't anticipate. So for instance, a lot of times that the freight systems that we use to deliver servers around the world are actually being carried in the bellies of passenger aircraft that are flying. And so as you had passenger aircraft stop flying, you had a lot less freight capacity. At the same time, the standard freight providers, the UPSs and FedExes and DHLs of the world, were all of a sudden completely overwhelmed because people shifted to e-commerce. And so that changed the entire equation. So our infrastructure team had to work incredibly hard to make sure that we could still get equipment to those locations around the world. But obviously, if you have a 50% increase in traffic in 7 days, even under normal circumstances, getting equipment there and provisioned and turned up is impossible. So I think the other piece that really helped us was we have the flexibility across our infrastructure to shift traffic around fairly substantially. So we may have a bunch of free customers that are using our services. We don't guarantee that those free customers are going to be delivered in every one of our locations around the world. And so as we had a customer where we had guaranteed them a higher quality of service, we could essentially shift free customers to a location that had excess capacity in order to provide the best quality of service for our paying customers. So that flexibility of being able to move traffic across our network was incredibly important. And we realized through this that while we had tools to do that to some extent, we actually had to invent a number of additional technologies to be able to shift traffic around. And so the last 6 months has been really us taking the lessons of COVID and the extreme conditions that put our network under, and building out the tooling to give ourselves even more flexibility going forward. And I think that will ensure that we can, both provide great service to our customers, but then also be a really good partner with our ISP partners around the world to be able to respond to whatever the circumstances and conditions are for them, because we want to make sure that as we do partner with those organizations, that we are a positive partner. And when one calls us up and says, hey, we need you to take load off of this particular circuit or move it there, having that tooling, I think, will make us an even better partner going forward.
Yeah, that's got to be one of the advantages of being global and with a scale out, highly flexible architecture. I guess the flip question for that would be, what challenges do you encounter doing business all around the globe? What makes your job easier or more difficult?
I mean, I'm amazed how much I've had to learn about, like import regulations and Brazilian, import taxes and things. There's, in order to move all the bits that we move, we've got to ship a whole bunch of atoms. And those atoms, there are rules that apply to them, and there are places in the world like Brazil where you can have equipment that gets hung up in customs. I think in our worst case we had it for 8 months, waiting for several $1 million of equipment to make it through customs. And so I think that creates, on the sort of just infrastructure deployment side, real challenges. I think then also on the regulatory side, we believe that we need to be in compliance with every law in all of the countries that we operate in around the world, and that's 100 countries globally. And so everything from making sure that we're following what the sort of import rules are, making sure that we understand what the sort of content regulation is in all of those locations around the world, making sure that we are complying with sort of the data sovereignty and data residency requirements. And that means that our legal team is sort of bigger than the average SaaS company that's out there. And I think that we have some of the same challenges that a typical ISP will have in terms of the regulatory challenges. But rather than being regional, we have to operate on a global basis, and so that puts a lot of load on our legal team, and has required us to become an expert in laws all around the world.
Well, when you say you have to keep an eye out also to be in conformance with content laws, I mean, you're at sort of such a foundational level of internet infrastructure, especially if packets are encrypted end to end. Like, what is your responsibility, or what should it be, or what can't it be?
Well, should is probably above my pay grade. We again, I think of ourselves as needing to comply with regulations and laws, regardless of what they are. But I would say that we try to be good citizens for the internet in general, and so we have invested pretty strongly in our public policy team to hopefully educate lawmakers in what is going on online. And so, for instance, over the last several months, the European Union has been working on the Digital Services Act, and in that, there is real concern, and I think this concern is well founded, that through some platforms that are promoting different types of content, that does put stresses on society, and that there probably is an appropriate place, and again, the rules might be different whether you're in the US versus you're in Europe versus you're in India versus you're in China, but that the responsibility, if you are aggregating content, promoting content, distributing content, that there are some responsibilities for all of us. But I think that those responsibilities are different depending on where you are in the stack. If you are just a mere conduit that's passing that content through, you're not doing anything to, particularly promote it or organize it or performing an editorial function. That might be different than if you are, out there trying to, make it incredibly popular, make it go viral. And so I think one of the things that we've invested in is really trying to educate regulators on what the difference is between being a domain registrar versus a DNS service versus an ISP versus a undersea cable operator. And I think that the sort of closer that you get to the end user, probably, if we're going to make this super simplistic, the closer you get to the end user, probably the higher the responsibility that you have for that content. And the further that you get away, probably the less responsibility you have for that content. The undersea cable operator, if it's carrying hate speech through its cables, it doesn't seem like that's the right place to be regulating that. And I think Cloudflare sits somewhere in between those things. And so I think it's a struggle for us because I think that there's always going to be pressure to try to control content, and given how much of the web sits behind us, that we become this sort of fulcrum that we will get pressure that is placed on us. And I think there are circumstances where, if you have a platform that is purely malicious, that is not responding to the rule of law, that we might be the sort of last line of defense. But I think that we're probably not the appropriate first line of defense for that. And we try to, again, live up to what our mission is of how can we help build a better internet and preserve the parts of it that are what are magical about the internet, and what caught most of the people in the audience to decide to dedicate their careers to really ensuring that the internet works as well as it does today.
So since you mentioned kind of relationships with regulators, and that part of your responsibility you feel is to help educate them as to the ins and outs of, IP routing protocols and things like that. As far as, let's say, other participants in the ecosystem, so besides regulators, let's think about network service providers, data center, co-location, interconnection facilities, et cetera. What is your relationship with them? And since we have a lot of them in this audience, what would you want them to hear that says, please folks, I'd really appreciate it if you do X, or stop doing Y, or, help me with Z?
I think that the thing that's hard about the internet at some level is that it's just a series of chicken and egg problems. So, taking it out of this audience to some extent, but like the browser guys don't want to do something because unless the server guys are going to do something, and the server guys don't want to do it unless the browsers want to do it. And you have that. I think that, a lot of, we all know what some of the challenges are around sort of the insecurity around BGP routing, the protocols that, the fact that DNS isn't encrypted by default. There's a series of these things where we all look out and go, if we could have designed the internet differently, we would have done a bunch of things different than we have. And, I think that oftentimes what we see our role at Cloudflare as being is that the organization that's going to sort of sit between the chicken and the egg and say, listen, we'll do whatever you want, but we all agree that we should be making, forward progress, and we'll support sort of both sides while we make transitions. And so, I think early on we did that with IPv6, where we said we're going to support IPv6 facing out to sort of the eyeball networks of the world, even if our customers, the server networks, are on hosts that are only on IPv4. And then we do the reverse, where if there's an eyeball network that's only on IPv4, but somebody wants to host entirely on IPv6, we're that translation layer that can sit in between that. And again, by providing that for free, I think it helped us, really increase the amount of usage of IPv6 that was out there. We did the same thing in 2014 with encryption, where obviously, as if you fast forward in history, like the future of the internet is going to be encrypted. And so it was a really scary thing for us to do, because at the time, the only difference between our free service and our paid service was basically encryption. And so by giving that away for free, we were really worried that people wouldn't pay us anymore. And, we are a business, but we looked out and we said, this is clearly the right thing to do. And so we should provide that and make that available. I think today, some of the things that we're really trying to push for, and again, trying to be good stewards in the ecosystem around is BGP security. And RPKI isn't the end of the solution, but it's a foundational step in getting there. And I think when we looked out and said, why aren't we signing routes? Why aren't we verifying that this is the case? Why is a route leak still a thing that plagues us all and such a frustrating problem? And if you sort of dug into it, everyone wanted to do the right thing, but the tooling didn't exist in order to make it easy. And so, we invested a ton of R&D, built out the tools, open sourced them, gave them away, and it's been really amazing to watch as the industry has taken this problem that we've all known about. I mean, we were talking about this 10 years ago, and a lot of people in the audience have been talking about it, for 30 plus years. We all knew this was a problem. What I'm proud about is, that we said, listen, we don't have to live with the way that it's been before. Let's actually catalyze a change and making that better. And you can literally see when, we, along with Google and a number of the big ISPs that were out there, and I mean, like AT&T taking a lead in this space was really, an amazing kind of watershed moment, that we were able to actually start to secure the underlying routing table. And again, it's not perfect. It's just the start, but at least it's a start, and at least we're making it better. And so if we all kind of imagine what the internet would be if we got to go back and redesign it, I think that what I've been really encouraged by is that by working together as an overall industry and figuring out how can we, solve these problems one by one by one by one, if you just look back over the last 10 years, the internet's gotten a lot better. And it's because of the people who are listening to this that we are making progress. And I think it's one of the kind of silver linings of COVID is, had COVID happened 10 years ago, I mean, it would have been even more disruptive than it's been. And that's not to diminish, the lives that have been lost, the incredibly hard work from, physicians and scientists, the businesses that unfortunately can't be virtual, the restaurants and barbershops and nail salons in the world.
We certainly have it better than 100 years ago with the Spanish flu, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, but again, it's the people who come to PTC that have enabled that progress. And if anything, I think that's accelerating, not decelerating. And so I think we as an industry have made the internet better, and I'm really proud of playing the small part that we have. So.
Speaking of the part that you've played, you created $25 billion worth of market cap from an idea in 10 years. And your background, I was astounded with, because you've got an MBA from Harvard, you've got degrees in law, in literature, and of course in computer science, and you're a ski instructor. So I'm just curious, where do you find the time? Is your breadth of background what's responsible for your success? What's your advice to me, people in the audience, and especially my 12-year-old daughter?
Well, so don't do what I did. I mean, the last bit worked out pretty well, but I wandered in the wilderness for quite some time. I mean, I think that this wasn't a deliberate plan. This was me trying to find something that was inspiring, and I got fortunate that that ended up with Cloudflare. But in the process, there were some pretty bad and dumb moves along the way. And I guess so I when I was 7 years old, my grandmother for Christmas gave me an Apple II Plus back in 1980, and I took to it like a duck to water, and loved it. And I, all the other kids wanted to play video games. I wanted to make video games. Really loved it. Went to college thinking I was going to study computer science. Had the minute I got into the dorm room, like had my computer set up and connected to the network. And so when the network technicians came around to set it up, they were like, "Oh, we should hire this guy." So I ended up learning, this was in the mid 90s, and we were building out the campus network. And so as a result of that, I was just happened to be in the right place at the right time to learn all about networking and switching and routing. And I was one of 3 students that basically was on call if something broke in the middle of the night. And it was the early days of the internet. So there was a lot of things that were breaking. Also just happened to kind of fall in with 3 other students who we decided to launch an online magazine. And originally we created it in HyperCard, the old Apple technology, and we would email it around. And the HyperCard stacks got so big that they would crash the mail server, and the school loved it. So they kept increasing, like upgrading the mail server basically just to support us. But at some point this became unsustainable. And so the school actually organized us to meet 2 different groups. One was this printer company based out in California that had this new technology called PDF. And I just love PDF. I was like, this is the future. This is gonna be everything. And the other was a group of graduate students at the University of Illinois that had this thing called a browser. And thankfully I voted for PDF. The other 3 voted for HTML. And so ended up, we created one of the sort of first online only magazine, if not the first online only magazine, won a bunch of awards. And so, but what was strange was at the time I hated all of this because it was impossible to get anyone at the college to write for like the online magazine, because the browsers were so flaky that they'd crash. And if you worked for the student newspaper in school, a lot of why you did it was to impress your fellow students. And so if the cute girl that I wanted to ask out to the dance couldn't even open this, I was like, what's the point? And so we had to write. And so I actually dropped out of the computer science program. I ended up minoring in it. But that was a pretty dumb and arrogant decision on my part. And I had to write a thesis, and in the end, and I'd switched to English literature, and I ended up writing a college thesis on why the internet was a fad, which I think that my career ever since has been just penance for how wrong that ended up being. I turned down offers.
You're wrong yet necessarily.
Well, yeah, let's see. It's I turned down offers to go work at companies I thought weren't going to go anywhere, like Netscape and Microsoft and Yahoo. I was like, Microsoft, who's that? What's that going to turn into? And that was pretty stupid in 1994. And instead, ended up going to law school. And in that sort of intervening time between when I started law school and when I graduated law school, it just became totally clear that I'd made just a bad set of career decisions. And so, really didn't practice law for very long. And then kind of spent 10 years sort of wandering in the wilderness, started a company that didn't go anywhere. And my parents were bugging me like, why aren't you just gonna go back and be a lawyer? And so I feel incredibly fortunate that that I met both Lee Holloway, who's the real technical genius behind Cloudflare, and then Michelle Zatlin, who's the operational genius behind Cloudflare. And the 3 of us started off on building this what at the time seemed like it just made sense. If you could have a security service that was a cloud service rather than being a box, who wouldn't do that? But I don't think any of us, had we known how complicated that would turn out to be, I don't know any of us would have would have started down that path. But it's it's been useful. And today, it turns out that my law degree is useful because we ended up having to deal with a lot of legal situations, and my English literature degree turns out to be pretty useful as well, because in my job now, most of what I'm doing is communicating either with employees or investors or various partners. So it worked out, but I think there are some more straightforward paths that your daughter can take, and I hope when she's ready to apply for an internship that she'll think about applying to Cloudflare.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you for all the insight, ranging from what my daughter should do to what the entire world should do with the internet. It was a great opportunity chatting with you, and I hope we can do it again.
Thanks, Joe. I really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to when we can do this, celebrate in Hawaii in person.
That would be great. For now, I just have my ABC cup, so
Mahalo.
looking forward to it. Mahalo.